Now it's time to zoom out and look at the global picture. I'm pleased to invite Kelli Kedis Ogborn to the stage for an overview of the key developments and milestones that shaped space activity around the world in 2025.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate Vocalocity starting off this segment because Dream On is actually on my hype playlist, so it was a perfect segue. I want to extend my deep gratitude to the event organizers and to the country of Israel for including me in this programming and in this conversation, especially at the really critical time that we are experiencing within the space ecosystem. I have to say that this presentation was really fun to put together, because about a year ago exactly, I was giving a keynote at a conference in Florida about the space economy, and it was truly remarkable how much has changed just in a year's time, and it's also truly remarkable how much was actually edited out of this presentation in the interest of time, which really underscores what so much of us in the community say often, is that we truly feel that we are at this inflection point in space. And 2025 demonstrated to us that it was less about individual mission success and technological development, and it was more about systems growth and market maturation under pressure. Business models were stress tested, systems and their accompanying capabilities were flying at what felt like an operational cadence. We saw tremendous market activity, which signaled confidence in the market and its commercial capabilities. We stopped asking, should we build this, and started asking, who will fund it, how will it scale, how will it regulate, and really started conversations about collaboration, cooperation, and integration, which is really the main theme. And so today's presentation is really meant to show some of the critical structural shifts that we are seeing within the ecosystem, underpinned by activities that occurred in 2025. So the 5 that we are going to cover is industry trends and capability growth, maturing capital markets, increased and diversified lunar activity, geopolitics and an emphasis on national security, and then we'll bring it home with the priority of economics and infrastructure. I want to warn you in advance, my presentation is not as pretty as the Israeli overview. I don't have those skills, but I hope the content makes up for it. So let's first start with industry trends and capabilities. One of the things that I will say about 2025 is that it definitely showed maturity at scale in these 4 areas. For launch in particular, one of the most remarkable things is that launch stopped being a bottleneck, but it also really stopped being a headline, which is amazing. Globally, we are now starting to see a launch once every 28 hours. The year previous, in 2024, it was a launch once every 34 hours. And so that window is really starting to decrease, and it just shows the velocity of what's being scaled. SpaceX set a new record with 165 orbital launches. Blue Origin's New Glenn heavy lift proved that we now have another heavy launch option to rival Starship, and we're starting to see diversity across other parts of the world, particularly Europe, with Ariane 6's commercial mission. On the commercial and private space missions, I think the main headline here is that they stopped being seen as a hobby and more started behaving as an industry. We're starting to see more serious ISS transition accelerated. There were private crewed missions became more routine. SpaceX's Dragon capsule continued to fly private and government missions, as well as Axiom sent its next fully private mission to the ISS, and space tourism grew. On the satellite front, we now have 10,000 active satellites in orbit. To really underscore the importance of that, in 2020, there were about 2,000, and by 2035, we think that there's going to be close to 50,000 active satellites in orbit. So it continues to increase, and the proliferation massively grows. The other thing I want to point out on this slide is just new industrial frontiers. You heard this really discussed in many presentations before today, but what we're starting to see with the advent of artificial intelligence and quantum computing put into operations is truly transforming the landscape in terms of missions and also systems development. On the maturing capital markets, private capital surged in 2025 with an estimated $55 billion invested, which spans everything from late-stage venture, growth PEs, as well as corporate financing. And we also saw some major IPOs by commercial companies, specifically Firefly, as well as Voyager. And there are announced IPOs for SpaceX as well as York Space. The reason why these are significant in the industry is that it really shows that the space market is not just a hobby of venture capital anymore, and it really has the ability for industry growth and investment and commercial scale, which is a really important point as we push more toward commercial capabilities coming into the industry. And SPACs have returned. If any of you remember the SPACs that happened in 2020, part of the challenge with that is that it called into confidence the viability of the market. We're now starting to see them return as actually a viable path to alternative funding, which again is signaling that commercial markets are on the rise. So increased lunar and diverse activity. You heard a lot this morning, and you'll continue to hear how the moon is engaged, particularly for the Artemis missions. But one of the biggest pieces that 2025 really showed us that is going to continue into 2026 is that lunar activity is becoming increasingly diversified, and it's leaning toward commercially enabled and internationally shared infrastructure. For some of the first times ever, we are now starting to see a divergence from one-off missions that are led by individual countries to now more integration and coordination. There were 3 lunar missions last year by private companies, 2 in the United States, 1 in Japan, as well as a growing body of capabilities put on board that now gives utility and access to the moon that we have never seen before. On the more political alliance front, the Artemis Accords grew to 60 countries with 10 signing in 2025. And what that means is that we are continuing to get a growing body of people that believe in shared practices and shared ways of engaging in space, both on the political alliance front as well as the commercial capability. And the biggest thing for me, I think, is this bottom point, is the shift from flags and footprints to infrastructure. You heard Amit talk in the morning that no longer is one country going to the moon alone. And what this symbolizes is that we are shifting from an environment where it is less national posturing and more looking at sustained and scalable infrastructure to not only allow countries to take advantage of the lunar surface, but the industries that are going to enable its growth and scale. On the geopolitical and national security front, a lot has happened. We were having a conversation during the break on this, and a lot of these movements are underpinned by a couple of things. The first is, it is not to be understated, the shifting climate globally, and the fact that space in most of the collective conversations is now understood as a warfighting domain and critical infrastructure. We've also had shifts of administrations, as well as capabilities acceleration by near-peer adversaries, not just in the United States, but globally. These are some of the things that happened in 2025, and really the main characteristics of these is meant to underscore sovereign capabilities and shifting partnerships. So first, the United States put out a call for a Golden Dome, which a lot of people are saying that it's America's Iron Dome. What that's done primarily for our industry is it has really put a punctuation around the growth of dual-use technologies and investment in defense-based capabilities. So a lot of our defense primes have started to shift their strategies to better understand how to take advantage of this growing landscape. The Trump administration has also put out an executive order really underpinning American superiority in space and what that means for our engagement with allies. The United States, of course, put out a space warfighting framework, but I think more interesting for me is that we're starting to see other countries outside of the United States and Israel have this focus. Japan, for example, put out a space defense framework, which is remarkable because countries are now realizing how these capabilities are meant to be taken advantage of. And then the last I want to mention is just the development of sovereign capabilities. We know that every nation has the ability to defend itself, and more broadly, it is felt that not just relying on international partners, but also having in-house capabilities is a really critical aspect. The one thing I want to say is that this is not meant to be seen as isolationism, but rather it's strategic alliance-based resilience or capability-enabled multilateralism. These partnerships that are evolving are very much on the lines of shared interests and shared engagement, but now that commercial is becoming so much more ingrained in how people engage in space, it's a very critical aspect to also have capabilities and economic return, because space is now really critically seen as an economic tool, and we know that economic security is national security. The last section I want to touch on is just the priority of economics and infrastructure. We are now in an environment, and 2025 proved that these adjacent industries are now integrated more than ever. We are starting to see an emphasis on economic development, on access to orbit as an infrastructure and not just a service. What this means is that utility and engagement is more active than it ever has before, and if there is not an economic bottom line, it is often reassessed on how it can be in the long run for certain missions. Space stations and in-orbit services were also reframed as industrial platforms. So for a very long time, the way that we engaged in space was through science missions and exploration and excitement. Now they are seriously being used as industrial and economic platforms. We are now going to start seeing manufacturing in space, transition of pharmaceuticals to new industries. What this is going to open up for industries is tremendous, and we're just at the precipice of being able to take advantage of this when some of these commercial space stations come online, which I am very excited about. And then the last piece is that, data sovereignty has now become an economic issue. For so long in space, we have talked about satellites giving utility and data and photos back down, but the sovereignty is now discussed in a very different way. And so data custody, cloud jurisdiction, AI rights, economic competitiveness now completely underscore the equation and the conversations that we have. So what does this mean as we move into 2026? I am an optimist, but I am also a pragmatist, and I truly do believe that we are actively building this future together. The best thing to do is just remember that this ecosystem, as it develops, is going to be a coordinated effort between government, commercial, international, and best understanding how to read the tea leaves, how to engage rightly, and what policies and what technologies to actually focus on that are going to fuel the future is really how you have to look at it. We are building it together, and thank you for being part of this conversation, and please continue what you're doing. Thank you.